When our politicians resemble folks like Vladimir V. Putin, well, we ought to notice, and we ought to take some action to try to make it to where they don't resemble autocrats, dictators like Putin, who, if he's not a dictator, is so close as to make no difference.
Welcome to This Week in Common Sense, starring Paul Jacob. This Week in Common Sense is the weekend wrap-up of thisiscommonsense.com, where Paul Jacob has provided commentary since 1999. And this week, we ended the week with a dictator in Russia.
Yes, and we brought it home because the title of the commentary was Putin and Householder for Life. And everybody knows it was a big story this week, if you follow the news, that Vladimir Putin, who has been in office because of the Russia's term limit law, which is part of the Constitution, he has been in office for 20 years, either as president most of the time, or he's switched up and switched places with a lieutenant who became president, and then he became prime minister. But for 20 years, in essence, has ruled over Russia in a very authoritarian way. And he is now in his second term, 6-year terms. He will be in office until 2024. But then the 2-term limit will hit, and he'll have to leave as president. And all of a sudden, the Duma, their Congress, proposes a law. And Putin comes to speak to the Duma and says he's okay with the new law. And the new law is this: they're going to keep the term limits, because even Putin said, someday it's probably going to be better for Russia to not be ruled by one person and have it be such a personality-driven dictatorship. Even Putin kind of recognizes that's the better way, but not anytime soon. So they keep the 2-term limit, but start a new clock. So the 20 years that he's been in power doesn't count anymore. And in fact, the next 4 years won't count anymore. And he can run for 2 more terms and serve until 2036. He will have then served longer than Stalin was in power in Russia. Not quite as long as Peter the Great, but at least he beat Stalin. And of course, in 2036, Putin will be 83 years old. I mean, at some point, the ultimate term limit, death, will take effect and cannot be repealed, at least thus far, by our leaders, so to speak. So I hear this story. I had several friends send me the story and say, oh, you're going to want to talk about this. And then, of course, I did want to and did. But I didn't think about the end of the story, the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say, until I got into reading about Putin and thinking about it and realized, oh my goodness, what Putin is doing in Russia, claiming in essence to understand term limits, and it's usually a good thing, but we have to keep stability, and I'm doing that right now. What causes me to just step back is realizing that what is happening right now in Ohio, in our fair country, is exactly what Putin's doing. Speaker of the House, Larry Householder, in Ohio, a Republican speaker, although elected with the majority of his votes coming from the Democrats, not the Republicans. He is behind an effort. Now, he says about term limits that they're pretty offensive to the people of Ohio, even though the people of Ohio love the term limits. They're not offended at all. But that's his claim. So he clearly doesn't like term limits. But they're pushing a measure, and he hasn't really taken ownership of the measure publicly. But he's clearly behind it in every way, shape, and form. And when we see the big special interests put their money behind the petition drive, we will know who asked them to do that. And that's Speaker of the House, Larry Householder. He is doing exactly what Putin is doing. Ohio has an 8-year limit in the House, an 8-year limit in the Senate. You can leave office and then you could serve again later, but you have to take a break. He is pretending he's going to make it tougher. So his scam, Putin, unfortunately, has such control of the country that he can, he can pretty much be assured that the court, it doesn't take effect until the Russia Supreme Court, Constitutional Court, I think is its specific name, but same as the Supreme Court here. And until they say okay, well, I think Putin is pretty much aware they're going to say okay, or else. And then there's going to be a plebiscite in April, so the people will weigh in. That's great, except that they don't really have free and fair elections in Russia because, of course, the state media is going to dominate everything, and they're going to say that this is a wonderful thing. People campaigning against it might be arrested, might be beat up. Several other bad things could happen. It's not going to be a fair fight. And then, of course, I have more than an inkling that if somehow the people mysteriously and amazingly cut through all the crap and went and took the risk of voting no, you don't get to set a new clock for yourself and serve until you're 83 years old, that the votes would get counted in a way that made those votes not count. So it's one thing in Russia, it's another thing in the US, but it's the exact same scam. It's getting a new clock. Term limits don't really have much impact if politicians constantly reset the clock, because the clock is everything. It's time to leave because you've served too long. Oh, but my past service doesn't matter anymore because I set a new clock. No, that's not gonna cut it. The scam in Russia is that it's an authoritarian place where democracy doesn't really exist. In Ohio, the scam has to be a little bit better because we have more rights, more mechanisms to fight against politicians who try to steal power and use it for their own devices. But this initiative is going to be sold to people as a way to make term limits tougher. That is the only way that anyone has ever successfully weakened a term limits law, is by lying to the public and saying it toughens it. So in Ohio, they would not have consecutive term limits. 8 years in, you have to take a break, you come back for 8 years. Instead, they would have draconian lifetime limits. The difference being that this measure that will be petitioned, and I hope it doesn't get enough signatures, but they'll lie to enough people that I suspect it will get enough signatures. But this would say, instead of 8 years in the House, 8 years in the Senate, same thing, we'll have 16 years, and it'll be a tough lifetime limit. Well, 16 years is not a term limit. It's a joke. And of course, very few people serve 8 in the House and then 8 in the Senate, or come back anyway. The term limits for most people is the end of their service, and they go on to live their life in other ways. But if you have 16 years, what's going to happen is that people will tend to stay for 16 years because they have the same seat and they can hold that seat as a powerful incumbent who today can do you favors because of their power, and then can ask for your vote so they can stay another term and another and another. And instead of that ending after 8 years with this new initiative, if it were to pass, they get 16 years. Now, the other, of course, key component is that Householder, just like Putin, sets himself a new clock. So all of his past service is out. Now, he won't serve until he's 83 under his little scheme. He only gets to serve until he's 76. But he will, if this passes, be able to sit in the speakership. One of the beauties of term limits is that the leadership doesn't have dictatorial power over members because they've been there forever and they're going to stay forever. And so if you buck the leadership, they can hold it against you and make you pay for it term after term. Well, now all of a sudden, if Householder, now the speaker, can be speaker for another 16 years, we're back to the old ways. And that's exactly what they want. And that's exactly what Putin wants. Putin wants more power over the lives of every man, woman, and child in Ohio. And he's going about it in precisely the same way that Larry Householder is going about it in Ohio, to allow him to have power for another 16 years, basically another generation. And yet it will be sold. And if you look at some of the media reports that I've looked at, it will be sold as toughening term limits. And frankly, so far, the media has pretty much bought that line. Now, most of the media, in my experience, is not for term limits. So I'm not expecting them to cover it very well. It's going to require a grassroots effort. It may require some money to advertise so that people hear the message. But there was a big scam that everybody who follows the news saw this week. Vladimir V. Putin getting around term limits in Russia. What they don't know, the rest of the story, is that what he's doing is exactly what Speaker Householder in Ohio is doing. Let's stop him. We can't really stop Putin. I don't see a way. You come up with one, leave it in the comments section. We'll act on it. But we can stop our own wannabe despots, and we better. And it's happening right now today in Ohio.
Well, that was the first one.
Yes. That was the last one. And, someone once said the last shall be first. And look, we've made it happen. But the first one was a theme we've often hit at Common Sense, at thisiscommonsense.com. Are we graduating from plastic? We talked about the plastic ban, plastic bags in New York City. And it just, people are aware of these things, and so we won't go on and on about it. But this is yet another case of let's do something for the environment. Let's do something about environmental degradation. And then we do something that I don't think has any real impact on the environment, any real positive change. It's all virtue signaling. It's all, let's do something that, it's kind of like the funny thing, God's coming, the second coming, look busy. Or in Washington, when they want to fix a problem, you go to a meeting and then you realize about 2 minutes into the meeting that we're not trying to fix the problem. We're trying to figure out a PR strategy to slough the problem off on somebody else, or to deny there's a problem, or what have you. Virtue signaling doesn't save the environment. It makes us feel better if we're not smart enough to realize that it doesn't save the environment. But increasingly, you worry that people know it doesn't really work. Throughout this country, the straw is our big enemy, and we've got to get rid of straws. And frankly, I'm not a big fan of straws. My kids always loved them, but I don't really like straws. So this one doesn't hurt me so much. But, I think there's a lot of little kids around this country who are just livid with what's going on. And well, they should be, because the plastic in the ocean, an infinitesimal amount of it is coming from the United States. Straws are not the problem, and getting rid of all the straws is not really the solution. And frankly, most of the paper straws I have ever started to use are not very good. Not very good. So this is more of that, let's act like we're doing something. Let's look busy. Let's suffer. Let's make other people suffer. Let's legislate something so that our policy is clear. We have collectively virtue signaled, and nothing really gets any better. And it strikes me that it's kind of the flip side of this, zero tolerance. We so hate guns that when a second grader chews his peanut butter sandwich into a gun shape and says, bam, bam, we need to call a SWAT team in to subdue him and drag him to Guantanamo Bay or somewhere. And we have all of these stories that constantly come up, and at the base of them is a complete unreality about how the world works that we take out on little kids as a society, all because we have to signal that we don't like people being murdered. We don't like people being shot and maimed or killed, as if somehow that isn't a given. I mean, I just think that ought to be a given. And because of that, we have to create this elaborate police state against little kids. And we've talked about that for years. But it strikes me that this sort of, let's ban plastic bags is the flip of that. Now we're going to make everybody suffer a little bit, but it's the same sort of virtue signaling, completely disconnected from doing any good in the world. As if, and frankly, the only way you can get away with that is that you don't ever measure what you're doing. You don't ever look for what the impact is. And of course, we fall into that all the time. How many government programs designed to help people, after a few years, they do a study, they find out it doesn't help people. Oh, yes, it does. It must, because we're so good, because we wanted to help. So it's kind of the opposite of science in a social science way. But the more we, it's almost like the more we shout something, the louder we shout it, the less it's true. And you hear so much talk about, that people who maybe are small government people deny the science as if we have experts and we can run the world in such a wonderful way. And yet, then you look at all the instances in which people tried to run the world in such a wonderful way, in some total way, like totalitarian way, and horrible results. And yet people never see it. In fact, I think the main reaction that people like you and I think most of our listeners have when they hear socialism is to think, if you give government that much power to do all these different things, how do you then restrain that government from doing all the things throughout history that have just been horrendous? And it's like a blank stare. Like, well, what are you talking about? As if all the bad things government did, as if the internment of Japanese Americans in camps in the United States during World War II was somehow disconnected from giving government the power to do things like that. And so they recognize the wrong of what government has done, and yet they have complete faith that if we give it the same power again, it will somehow act benevolently. It's like the people I hear sometimes, and you kind of know what they mean, or what you think they mean, what you hope they mean, when they talk about what we really should have is benevolent dictatorship. Because, of course, democracy's messy, and democracy can be wrong. It can be horribly wrong. And I think small d Democrats like me have to admit that it can be horribly wrong, or we lose all credibility. But at the same time, when I hear someone say something about a benevolent dictatorship, I think that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, because there's been none ever in history, and there won't be any, and we all know that. So why pretend that that's going to happen? It strikes me in my crazy head as the same as when I hear someone talk about a country club prison. What that always tells me is they've never been to prison, because there is no country club prison. You could not pump in enough cable TV to make any prison a country club, because the number one attribute of a country club is that you usually have to pay a lot of money. I'm not a member of a country club. You have to pay a lot of money and you get to be there and you want to be there. And if you ever want to leave, there's no guard holding you in. And so, when people say that, it means I've heard a bunch of media tell me this phrase, and I now believe it. But it's anyone who has any knowledge knows it's not true. So it's the whole idea of democracy, to me, springs from, if there's 3 of us who want to go eat, or if there's 7 of us who want to go to a movie and figuring out what movie we go to, we would use some sort of democratic process in doing that because we're all equal and our desire for what food or what movie is equal. And of course, there are better ways, and we talk about ranked choice voting at thisiscommonsens.com often, and other reforms, term limits. There's all kinds of, so that the same people don't get to choose, 4 of the 7 don't get their movie every, because the other 3 would vote with their feet and go to a separate movie. There's all kinds of ways to make democracy work better. And it needs every check and balance and protection for human rights. But when people talk about democracy without any recognition that without it we're left with oligarchies and dictatorships, I wonder how they come from that perspective. And it also means that I think those of us who are small d Democrats do have to recognize we need all those limits. So democracy is no panacea, but the hits on it, I think, are not helpful. They're not smart. It's people who know enough to be dangerous, I think, in dismissing it, because it is a path to protect our rights from those in government. A lack of democracy has not achieved that in all the times it's been tried. And in fact, one of the most interesting things to me is the degree to which you will hear the Chinese Communist Party argue against democracy. In most of the world, Putin pretends he's a Democrat, small d. Other leaders like Erdogan in Turkey and other places, they always want the veneer of being democratic. They pretend that the people are with them. In China, the one embrace of communism, other than as a totalitarian, they want totalitarian government. How communist versus capitalist, they want to be in charge of everything. What do you call that? Well, I call it totalitarian. And they are adamantly opposed to democracy throughout this coronavirus pandemic. Their argument is that we have a better system because we can do everything by command. And I think there's been plenty written, and we've discussed here at thisiscommonsens.com how false that is and how dangerous and ineffective top-down government is in solving a lot of these problems. But democracy, politicians, when they talk about democracy, it is winning an election. It's not democracy unless they win. But most of us recognize that we have to have a way to make decisions that are fair, that we make collectively. Those decisions are limited. People have rights against that democratic process, but it has to be a democratic process at the heart of what government legitimately does.
This is end of part 1 of This Week of Common Sense for the second full week of March 2020. My name is Timothy Virkala. You can find me at locofoco.net. And Paul Jacob writes daily in the week at thisiscommonsens.com. Part 2 will appear on Sunday. Thank you.